Hi, welcome to this short but extensive video about BIAS 2, a new module by Joranalogue Audio Design. BIAS 2 is a very clever utility module. You can use it to mix signals, you can use it to offset signals, both positive and negative. You can use it as an averager when you use the divide by 2 output. You can use it as an amplifier if you use the times 2 output. And it's not only versatile, it's also very precise. You can use this as a precision mixer for control voltages that take care of pitch. You can use it to create different versions of one source signal. And I'm pretty sure there's more things that you can do with BIAS 2 than what I thought of. And instead of playing you a few sound examples, which I don't think make a lot of sense for this unit, I will just jump straight into demonstrating how the module behaves and what we can do with its several in and outputs. So let's have a look at BIAS 2. Throughout the video, I will be using the red trace as the output of BIAS 2. Now let's start off with the top part of BIAS 2. And I will be sending in a triangle coming from Generate 3, which is just off screen. Let me zoom out a little bit. Well, yes. I sometimes get into arguments with my oscilloscope here, but I have a feeling that maybe today it will behave. So as you can see, this is a bipolar signal. The little orange arrow here indicates where the 0 should be. You can see it when I remove the signal. So this is a bipolar triangle wave coming from Generate 3. It lives between +5 and -5 volts. So let's send this signal into the topmost input of BIAS 2, and let's monitor the regular output here. I think this is a bit more clear. So the white line is the 0 axis for the output of BIAS 2, and the green line is what we are sending in. And you can see that there is an offset of 5 volts. And to understand what's going on, it's probably also important to know that every horizontal line on the oscilloscope is marks 5 volts. So right now the red trace is, well, 2 lines above the 0 axis, which mean that this red triangle wave lives between 0 and 10 volts. And this is because there is, as you can see from the panel, a 5 volt normalization to the second input here. And this just means that when you don't send anything in, the output of the top part of BIAS 2 mixes whatever we are sending in with a static offset of 5 volts. As soon as you connect something to this second input, the normalization is, well, not normalized anymore. So by inserting a cable or another signal, we are breaking the normalization. And at this point, the output of BIAS 2, at least this one, just gives us a mix of the two things that we are sending in. So if you want to mix pitch CVs, this is probably the way to go. And we can do exactly the same thing on the bottom half, but we'll get there a bit later. And let's now have a look at what the divide by 2 output gives us. The order of operations here is first the signals are mixed, so the triangle that lives between 5 and minus 5 volts gets offsetted with 5 volts, so it no longer lives between 5 and minus 5. No, it becomes a unipolar triangle that lives between 0 and 10 volts, and then we divide this signal by 2, which gives us a triangle that lives between 0 and 5 volts. And all of this offsetting and dividing can be very useful if you want to interface modules with each other. For example, certain Joranalogue modules don't react to negative voltages, and maybe you only have bipolar modulators, which can be a little bit annoying, but with BIAS 2 you can offset all your modulators to be positive. And if the module you're sending modulation to expects signals between 0 and 5 volts, you can use this divide by 2 output to convert your modulator to be something that works in your system. When you don't send anything into the inputs, you can still use the outputs because the +5 normalization is always present until you connect something to the second input here. So it shouldn't be a surprise that when we monitor this output here, that we are just getting that 5 volt static offset. And the divide by 2 gives us the mix of the first two inputs, which is just the 5 volts we're seeing here, and this gets divided by 2. So we are getting 2.5 volts of static offset from this. So the bottom part of BIAS 2 is very similar to the top part, but in some ways it's kind of the inverted version of the top half. And by the way, the bottom part of BIAS 2 is not normalized to the top part. So if you send something in here, it's not normalized to the bottom part. These two parts are really just completely separate. Let me try showcasing what this bottom part is good for this. So let me zoom in again first. So for this, I'm going to send in a cycling envelope. And as you can see, this envelope lives between 0 and 10 volts. And you can use cycling envelopes as VCOs. But sometimes you really want a bipolar signal. See what I mean? This sometimes my scope is really in a mischievous mood. And I do realize that some of you are screaming that I should turn up this level here to make the scope sync with this wave, but then I lose my reference for the 0 line, which I think is important for this particular demo. So yeah, let's get back on track. We're using a cycling envelope as a VCO. And while it's perfectly okay to use a positive signal, a unipolar signal as a VCO, sometimes you really need it to be bipolar. And that's of course where BIAS 2 comes in. So I'm sending this positive signal into the top input of the bottom half of BIAS 2. And I'm going to use this output here. And as you probably have guessed already, this way I'm mixing my unipolar cycling envelope with a -5 volt offset. And of course, this gives us a nice bipolar signal that's evenly distributed along the 0 axis. Now you can't hear the difference, but sometimes this is important. Maybe you want to use a cycling envelope as an LFO, and maybe you need this LFO to be bipolar. Well, BIAS 2 is your best friend. Again, when I connect a dummy cable to the minus 5 volt input here, the normalization is broken. And we're just getting the same signal out of this output as we're sending in. Now, this particular envelope lives between 0 and 10 volts, but not all modules are equal, and some envelopes live between 0 and 5 volt. And you might need a signal that's hotter, that's between 0 and 10 volts. And again, BIAS 2 can help you with this if you use the bottom output here, which gives us the signal we're getting from the regular output, but it's multiplied by 2, so it's amplified, which you can see here. Maybe you start off with a positive cycling envelope that lives between 0 and 5 volts. And you need it to be amplified, but you also need it to be bipolar with an equal distribution along the 0 axis. So what we then need to do is first offsetting the signal with 5 volts, which means it's going below 0. Then we amplify it, but it's still below 0. And if we send this signal to the top part here, and let's just do this in our head. We had an envelope living between 0 and minus 10 volts. I'm connecting this output to the input of the top half of BIAS 2. There's 5 volt offsetted to this signal, which means that our 0 to minus 10 envelope now lives between 5 and minus 5 volts. And this is clearly demonstrated if I connect this here. And maybe you need it to be between 2.5 volts and minus 2.5 volts. Well, that's no problem. And you just use this output. As you can see, you can do a lot of things with BIAS 2. One use case of BIAS 2 is using it as a precision adder, and I just quickly want to demonstrate how precise exactly this is. I'm running 2 voltages into my oscilloscope. The first one is exactly 1 volt and the second is 0.61 volts. You can see on the bottom 2 channels there's some residual voltage coming out of thin air. You can also see that the voltage that I'm running into the oscilloscope fluctuates a little bit. But let me run these 2 voltages through BIAS 2 to see what we end up with if we sum these 2 voltages. So I'll just run them into, well, it doesn't matter, let's use the bottom half of BIAS 2, and then let's take the red cable to monitor the output. So we should end up with, well, at this moment 1.59 volts, and as you can see, that's exactly what we end up with. So that's how precise a precision adder is. One thing you can use this for is to run through a pitch sequence and then add something to that. And let me demonstrate this. So this is a sound coming from Generate 3. I've self-patched the core output to the flip sync input, and I'm modulating the phase with filter 8. And that gives us this sound. Now let's run in a sequence. This is a quantized sequence coming from Moskwa 2, and if I run this sequence through BIAS 2, let's use this input just so we break the normalization, and run the output back into my VCO. And maybe you want to run some FM into your VCO. Now Generate 3 has a multitude of FM inputs, but some oscillators don't. So if you want to get some FM or just a slow vibrato going on, you need to mix your pitch sequence with some kind of LFO. And I want to mix this LFO with my pitch CV to make that work. So I'll just mix these two together in BIAS 2. Now of course I need to attenuate this LFO. So now you can hear that I'm getting the pitch sequence that I sent in. And it's accurately mixed with bipolar LFO to create some vibrato. I can crank up the rate of this LFO and the amplitude, and then we get these FM tones. Which is of course a whole lot of fun. Another example of when you could use BIAS 2. Let's first listen to this sequence. The VCO that we are watching on the screen here is an output of Generate 3. And to the right of my oscilloscope you can see that I have this triple wave shaper by Search Modular by Random Source. And this module works within the range of 0 to 5 volts. There are jumpers on the back of this unit to shift its range to be between 2.5 and minus 2.5 volts. But since it's originally intended to be operating within 0 to 5 volt range, I didn't want to change anything. But of course, if we send a bipolar signal through, you can see that the end result that we are getting from the module is a positive signal. Let me change some of the parameters here. Now this thing sounds really cool, but it's a little bit annoying. Well, at least if all your other modules expect bipolar signals, it's a little bit annoying that you're getting this unipolar positive signal. And of course, as soon as Joran told me about BIAS 2, I told him that it would be really a good utility to have in combination with this kind of wave shaper module. So what do we need to happen? We need to offset this signal with 5 volts. So let's start by doing that. I'll send the output into the bottom half of BIAS 2. Let's monitor what we're getting from the regular output. And if I reintroduce the line for the 0 axis, you can see that indeed now we have a bipolar signal. Now it's very weak compared to, let's quickly patch an output of Generate 3 to the scope. You can see that these triangle oscillations are a lot louder. It's a signal that lives between 5 and -5 volts. And ideally, I would want the output of this wave shaper to match that. Well, of course, you probably already guessed. We can do this by just using the bottom output here, which multiplies the signal by 2, as you can see on the oscilloscope. And if we now listen to this, this will be a much louder signal. This will probably work a lot better if you want to do more processing with this signal. Now, just a quick tip about wave folders and wave shapers. It can get really interesting if you start modulating them at audio rates. And I've been talking about offsets this whole video, but another word for offset is bias. So that's of course why this module is called BIAS 2. And this is going to be it for this video about BIAS 2 by Joranalogue Audio Design. It's a really interesting module, very useful to have in your system, because there's been quite a few moments in my patching history that I want to offset a signal to get it to be bipolar, or the other way around. I want a bipolar LFO to be unipolar. And you can achieve this by sending it through mixers and adding offset manually. But it's just really easy to have this kind of module ready. You just patch it the way you want to use it and you're done. So thanks again to Joran and the whole crew at Joranalogue Audio Design for letting me play around with this module. And to you, thanks for watching this video. I hope you learned something. See you next time. Bye.